The champagne was cold in my hand and everyone around me was laughing. And I had never felt more invisible in my life. My cousin's wedding was exactly the kind of event I'd been dreading for months. The venue was this converted heritage building in downtown Vancouver. Exposed brick, Edison bulbs strung across the ceiling, white peonies on every surface. Beautiful, genuinely. But I'd arrived alone after my boyfriend of 3 years had ended things over text 4 days earlier, and I was still walking around with that particular kind of hollow that settles in your chest when something you thought was permanent turns out not to be. I found a quiet corner near the bar and stayed there. It was easier that way. I didn't have to answer questions about why I wasn't out on the dance floor, didn't have to explain the missing +1, didn't have to smile and say I was doing great when anyone could look at me and see I wasn't. "You're hiding," said a voice beside me. I turned. A man had appeared next to me. Tall, dark suit, no tie, the kind of face that made you look twice without quite knowing why. He was holding a glass of whiskey and watching the room with an expression I recognized immediately. He wasn't hiding exactly, but he wasn't quite present either. "I'm not hiding," I said. "I'm observing." The corner of his mouth moved. From a corner, behind a flower arrangement. "The flowers are very good here." He looked at the peonies, then back at me. "They are," he said seriously, and something about the way he said it made me laugh for the first time in 4 days. His name was Jonathan. He told me this the way people tell you things at weddings. Like the event itself creates a kind of permission for honesty, a temporary suspension of the usual social calculations. He said he was the groom's business partner, and that he'd been dreading this wedding almost as long as I had. He didn't ask me why I was in the corner. He just stayed in the corner with me, and that felt like the kindest thing anyone had done for me all week. We talked for 20 minutes or 30. I lost track. About the appetizers, about the band, about the fact that the venue used to be a telegraph office in the 1890s, and how strange it was that the same building that once carried urgent messages across a continent now hosted people slow dancing to a Bruno Mars song. He knew things. Not in the performing way some people do, where you can feel them waiting for you to be impressed. Just quietly, easily, like information had collected in him naturally over time. And then my aunt materialized at my elbow. "There you are," she said, ignoring Jonathan entirely. "Sweetheart, where's?" She glanced around me with that searching look, and I knew exactly what she was about to say. And I couldn't. I absolutely could not have that conversation right now. Not in front of everyone. Not with the ceremony photos still up on the slideshow behind her. Jonathan's hand appeared at the small of my back. It was light. Just fingertips. But it was deliberate. And when I looked at him, he was already looking at my aunt with a calm, easy smile. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. "I've been monopolizing her all evening. You must be family. She has your eyes." My aunt blinked. She looked at him, then at me, then at his hand, and something in her face shifted. "Oh," she said. "I didn't realize you'd brought someone." "We wanted to keep things low-key," Jonathan said smoothly, and the "we" landed so naturally that I almost believed it myself. My aunt smiled the smile of someone who has just decided they don't need to worry about you anymore, patted my arm, and drifted back toward the dance floor. I waited until she was out of earshot, then I turned to him. "You didn't have to do that," I said. He considered this. "She was about to ask you something you didn't want to answer. You don't know that." "I do, actually." He took a sip of his whiskey. "You had the look." "What look?" "The one that says, 'Please don't.'" I stared at him. He was right, of course. I'd been broadcasting it so clearly a stranger had picked it up from across a conversation. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. We stood there for a moment in silence that was, somehow, not uncomfortable. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "whatever happened. The thing that brought you here alone, it reads on you the way grief does. Like something real. Not like something you should have to answer questions about at a wedding." I didn't say anything. There was a pressure behind my eyes that I refused to give into. "Come on," he said. "They're about to do the cake. Standing near the cake is better than standing near the bar." "Is it?" "You get first access to the corner pieces." "That's actually a compelling argument," I said, and he smiled again. That same understated, private smile. And I followed him across the room without quite deciding to. We ate cake by the window overlooking Gastown and the harbor lights. And he told me about growing up in Halifax and moving west for work. And I told him about growing up 20 minutes from where we were standing, and somehow never feeling like I'd quite figured out the city that had raised me. He listened the way people rarely listen, without planning his next sentence while I was still talking. At some point, we ended up outside on the terrace because it was June and the night was soft and the music was quieter out there. We leaned against the railing and I pointed out the mountains, and he said he still wasn't used to the fact that you could see mountains from a downtown sidewalk. I've lived here 32 years, I said. I still stop sometimes. That's a good sign, he said. Of what? That you haven't gone numb to it. I thought about that. I thought about the last 3 years and how much of it I'd spent going numb to things I should have stopped and looked at more carefully. The missed dinners, the conversations that ended in shrugs, the long, flat silences that I'd told myself were comfortable when really they were just familiar. I think I might have gone numb to some other things, I said without meaning to. He didn't push. He just nodded, slow and even, like what I'd said made sense. Those things have a way of finding you again when you're ready, he said. We went back inside when the dancing started again. My aunt found me twice more, and both times Jonathan materialized in a way that seemed casual, but wasn't. And both times she retreated satisfied, and at some point I stopped being surprised by it and started being grateful in a different, deeper way. Not for the rescue itself, but for the fact that he was paying enough attention to know when one was needed. He drove me home. I hadn't asked him to. It came up naturally when I mentioned I'd taken transit, because parking downtown was unreasonable, and he said he had a car and was going north anyway, and it was no trouble. I almost said no out of the reflex that makes women say no to things like that. Not because they don't want them, but because they've spent so long second-guessing their own instincts that saying yes feels like a risk. But I looked at him, and I thought about the terrace and the corner pieces, and the way he'd put his hand on my back, without making it into something it wasn't, and I said yes. The drive was easy. He had the radio on low, CBC late night, some jazz program, and the city was quiet, the way Vancouver gets quiet after midnight. The streets still damp from earlier rain, the neon smearing in reflections on the pavement. We talked about the wedding, about my cousin and her new husband, who seemed like a genuinely good match, about whether it was possible to actually know that from the outside, or whether you were always just projecting. I think you can sometimes tell, I said. The way they look at each other when they think no one's watching. What does that look like? I thought about it. Like they know something. A private thing. And it makes them quieter, not louder. He didn't respond right away. Outside, the Stanley Park trees rose up dark on either side of the causeway. Yeah, he said eventually. I think that's right. He pulled up outside my building. The light above the entrance was that flat, ugly yellow that all apartment lobbies have, and I was suddenly very aware of how tired I was. Not physically, but in that deep compound way that comes from holding yourself together all evening. Thank you, I said, for the ride, and for the earlier. It was good company, he said. I mean that. I believed him. That was the strange thing. I believed him. I got out of the car and went inside and didn't sleep for 2 hours, lying in the dark, thinking about the specific way he'd said the thing that brought you here alone. Not as a question, not as an opening for gossip, just as an acknowledgement that something had happened, and that it mattered. No one had said that to me yet. Everyone else had said there's plenty of time, or you'll be fine, or honestly maybe it's for the best. He hadn't said any of those things. He'd just seen it. I found out 3 days later that he was the sole owner of Hargrove Capital, one of Vancouver's largest private investment firms. I found this out not from him but from my cousin, who called me to say she and her husband were back from Tofino, and had I mentioned anything to Jonathan at the wedding because he'd apparently asked about me. Asked how, I said. Asked what your name was, your full name. She paused. He looked you up, I think. I sat with that for a moment. He's not exactly a regular person, my cousin said carefully. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean he has a lot of weight around him. People know who he is. I knew the name Hargrove Capital vaguely. It was in the news occasionally, acquisitions and development projects, The kind of company that shaped the skyline quietly without many people knowing whose decisions were behind it. I hadn't connected it to the man eating cake with me by the window. He texted that evening. I didn't know how he'd gotten my number, and I didn't ask. I'd like to take you to dinner if you're open to it. No occasion. Just dinner. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, I should probably know more about you first. He replied, that's what dinner is for. We went to a small Italian place on Commercial Drive that he'd clearly chosen because it was not the kind of restaurant someone takes a person to impress them. Small tables, handwritten menu on a chalkboard, the owner coming out to say hello. I noticed that. I noticed a lot of things about Jonathan that I hadn't noticed at the wedding, or maybe I had noticed them and hadn't known what to do with the information. The way he listened. The way he didn't perform ease but simply had it. The way he asked questions that were actually questions, not conversational placeholders. I asked him about his work. He was honest in a way I hadn't expected. He said it was complicated, that there were parts of the development industry in Vancouver he was uncomfortable with. The housing thing, the displacement thing, the way private capital had warped the city he'd come to love, and that he was trying to figure out how to operate with integrity inside a system that didn't make integrity easy. That's a surprisingly honest thing to say about yourself, I said. I'm working on being more honest, he said. I spent a long time being very good at the version of myself that people expected. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. We walked after dinner, because the drive was alive that evening, and neither of us wanted to be inside yet. He bought me gelato from a place that had been there since the 90s, and we sat on a bench outside and ate it, and I thought, obscurely, about how strange it was that 4 days ago I'd been in my apartment crying over a text message and now I was here. Can I ask what happened? He said. You don't have to tell me. My boyfriend ended things, I said. 4 days before my cousin's wedding, which was spectacular timing on his part. I'm sorry. The worst part isn't the ending, I said. The worst part is that I'm not sure I'm sad about the right things. I'm sad about the routine, the Tuesday dinners, the familiarity. But I don't think I'm sad about him. That's not a small thing to realize. No, I agreed. It's pretty enormous, actually. He was quiet for a moment. The streetcar went by. I was engaged once, he said. 7 years ago. It was real, I think, at the beginning. But I was building the company, and I wasn't present for it the way I should have been. And one day she said she felt like she was in a relationship with the idea of me, and not actually me. And I didn't have a good answer for that. What did you do? I let her go, he said, and then I threw myself into work for about 4 years, because it was easier. He looked down at the gelato. I'm not recommending that approach. Noted. He smiled. What I'm saying is, sometimes the sadness you feel isn't for the person. It's for the time, the version of yourself that existed inside that particular relationship, and that's a real loss. It's not nothing. I looked at him. Who told you that? I asked. A therapist, he said, completely without embarrassment. In Burnaby. I've been seeing her for 3 years. She's very good. I laughed. I hadn't expected that either. I was beginning to understand that with Jonathan, the unexpected was going to be a pattern. He texted me the next day, and the day after that. Not in the constant flooding way that feels like pressure, but in the deliberate, measured way that feels like intention. A photo of the harbor at sunrise because he'd been out early. A question about a documentary I'd mentioned. One afternoon, a message that just said, "How are you today? Actually." And I found myself answering, actually. We had dinner again the following weekend. And the weekend after that. At some point the dinners became the thing I was quietly oriented toward, the thing the rest of the week was built around. And I noticed this, and it scared me enough that I almost canceled the third one. I called my sister instead. She listened to all of it and then said, "What exactly is the thing that scares you?" "Everything," I said. He has so much weight around him. That's what my cousin said. People know who he is. And I'm a graphic designer who takes the bus and has 3 cacti on her windowsill and cries at nature documentaries. Those things aren't opposites, my sister said. It's not about opposites. It's about, what does someone like that need with someone like me? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, maybe he's tired of being someone like that. Did you think of that? I hadn't. The thing I wasn't told until later, the thing I had to piece together from fragments over time, was that Jonathan had not been in Vancouver the night of my cousin's wedding by coincidence. He'd been there because the groom was genuinely one of his oldest friends, yes. But he had almost not come. He'd had a board meeting running long, and a flight to catch to Calgary the next morning for something significant, and he'd almost sent a card and his regrets. He came because he'd said he would. He told me this on a Sunday afternoon, months later, sitting in his kitchen in Point Grey while I was making coffee, and he was reading the paper, the actual physical paper, which I found endearing. And it came up because I'd asked him once, idly, whether he'd expected anything from that evening. "No," he said. "I expected to have one drink, wish them well, and leave. But you stayed. I found something worth staying for," he said. And he wasn't looking at me when he said it. He was looking at the paper, and somehow that made it more real rather than less. I'd been falling in love with him for weeks without letting myself call it that. I was calling it other things. Interest, comfort, the fact that he makes me feel like myself. But sitting in that kitchen on that Sunday with the coffee and the paper and the light coming in through the west-facing windows, I let the word exist. And it wasn't scary. It was just true. His world was not simple. I want to be honest about that. There were things about the business that were opaque to me for a long time. Decisions I didn't have the context to understand. Relationships with people I didn't entirely trust. There were evenings he came home quiet and unreachable, carrying weight he couldn't put down, and I had to learn how to be present for that without pressing at it, how to sit in the same room with him and to let the silence be what it needed to be. And there were things he had to learn too, that I would not disappear just because he was difficult. That I would say when something wasn't okay. That I'd been in a relationship already where I'd made myself smaller to fit, and I wasn't doing that again, not for anyone. The first time I said that to him, not gently, not with a softening, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I wouldn't want you to. Then don't make me choose between staying and taking up space." "I won't," he said. "Tell me when I'm doing that." "I will," I said. "I promise." That was the real beginning, I think. Not the wedding. Not the first dinner. Not the Sunday with the newspaper. That conversation, in the middle of a Tuesday evening that had started badly, when we both said the true thing instead of the easy thing. The letter came on a Thursday. It wasn't a letter in the digital sense. It was a handwritten note on paper from his actual desk, the heavy cream kind. And it was waiting for me when I got home from a work meeting that I'd told him had stressed me out. A pitch I wasn't sure I'd landed. I'd given him a key 2 weeks before. I hadn't made a ceremony of it. I'd just left the spare on the counter one morning and said in case you're ever here before me and we'd both understood what it meant. The note said, "You are better than you think you were in that meeting. This is something I am certain of because I've watched you approach every difficult thing with the same particular carefulness. The one that looks like worry from the outside, but is actually just you being very thorough, which is different. You asked me once what I was looking for when I came to that wedding. I told you I wasn't looking for anything. That was true. What I didn't say was what I found, which is someone who makes me feel like the version of myself I'd given up on, like there's time still, like the next part is the part that matters. I'd like you to consider moving in. Not because of practicality. Because I want to fall asleep in the same apartment as you, which is the most honest thing I know how to say." Jai read it twice. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor, just sat down, right there, like my legs had decided they were done. And I held the paper, and I thought about the wedding in the corner, by the flowers and the champagne that was cold in my hand, and how invisible I'd felt, and how, 4 days before, that I'd been reading a text message that ended 3 years and thinking, somehow that this was what my life added up to. And then I thought about how wrong I had been. I texted him a single word. "Yes." He replied 30 seconds later. "Good. I'll make dinner." I tell people sometimes, friends who are in that particular hollow place, the one I know well, that love doesn't announce itself the way we're told it will. It doesn't arrive with clarity. It arrives looking like a stranger in a corner at your cousin's wedding, who notices you're hiding and stays to eat cake with you, and doesn't ask you to explain the sadness he can see. It arrives in the form of someone who makes room, who says, "How are you, actually?" and waits for the real answer? Who writes it down on heavy paper and leaves it on your counter because he knows you'll need to hold it in your hands to believe it? I believed it. I still do.